The young engineer helped a homeless man and gave him a job in his garage. After some time, he was shocked to see what had happened to his business. From a young age, Rodrigo was fascinated with mechanical devices and all kinds of gadgets. Anything related to technology and electronics drew him like a magnet. As a child, he would dismantle and assemble toys, clocks, and other devices, trying to understand how they worked. As Rodrigo grew older, he was determined to attend university to pursue a technical degree and become an engineer. Upon finishing school, he easily gained admission to one of the capital's prestigious institutions, having already excelled in numerous competitions and Olympiads. Rodrigo didn't want to leave home for the big city, but his thirst for knowledge and opportunities for growth pulled him there. Tearfully bidding farewell to his beloved grandmother, to whom he was deeply attached, embracing his parents, he boarded the train. Ahead of him lay a completely different, independent life. The academic journey proved challenging, but Rodrigo's determination and love for technology and mechanisms helped him overcome various difficulties. He diligently studied mathematics, physics, mechanics fundamentals, and actively participated in faculty team projects and initiatives. Fortunately, he found like-minded friends quickly, and Rodrigo was fortunate with his professors, all young and talented, inspiring students to pursue new achievements. Encouraged by them, Rodrigo participated in various competitions and scientific conferences, presenting his projects and innovative ideas. It was at university where he learned courage. He dared to dream and openly share his aspirations with others. Always among the top students, Rodrigo graduated with honors and immediately received a job offer as an engineer at a large industrial equipment company. He gladly accepted, and his entire family, including his elderly grandmother, was very proud of him. However, working in a large metropolitan company proved challenging. Early mornings, metro rides, and a work routine vastly different from his academic life awaited him. Often, he found himself longing to introduce innovations, only to be rebuffed by superiors who viewed him as a novice interfering in professional matters. Rodrigo had to muster patience and continued doing what was assigned, dreaming that one day he could start his own business and set things up as he wished. Ultimately, his experience in a large company helped him gain skills essential for business management. However, over time, he realized more keenly that he wanted to implement his own ideas and create something unique. He hesitated for a long time to resign, unsure if he was ready to run his own business. One evening, however, he decided he could no longer continue as before. The next day, Rodrigo informed his superiors that he was leaving the company. His decision shocked them. "We were planning to promote you in a couple of months," his boss said, but Rodrigo stood firm in his decision. He had already made his choice. He knew it wouldn't be easy, especially initially, and he understood he would face financial setbacks. Yet, Rodrigo believed in his dream and was ready to try to make it a reality, bringing something new to the world of technology and mechanisms. Naturally, he lacked substantial capital and the means to rent an office. Therefore, he turned his garage into a small workshop where he began working on his own projects. Rodrigo began with the development of an innovative device for automating household processes. He worked day and night, refining his invention and testing it practically. His garage was filled with tools, drawings, and prototypes. The young man hardly ate or slept, so engrossed was he in his idea. However, when the time came to showcase the device to potential investors, his concept failed miserably. Nothing worked as he had envisioned during the presentation. Investors declined to invest in Rodrigo's device, explaining that it wasn't ready for production. To say Rodrigo was devastated upon hearing the investors' verdict would be an understatement. He was crushed. He had invested all his previously saved capital into the project and now found himself without money or a job. Rodrigo didn't know what to do. Thankfully, he had the idea to call his best friend from university. Diego worked in a large company owned by his father. Upon hearing Rodrigo's situation, Diego promised to come over the next day and review his project. "Maybe it will interest my father's company," Diego encouraged him. However, when Rodrigo presented his innovative equipment to Diego, he agreed with the investors. The device required significant improvements and refinements. But to do this, it will take at least another 6 months, if not more, Rodrigo lamented, running his hands through his hair. I don't have that kind of opportunity. Diego shrugged. Then perhaps you should postpone the project for now, he advised. It's the only sensible decision at the moment. Rodrigo agreed with him. He decided to convert the garage into a workshop for repairing machinery and devices and began earning a living from equipment repairs. Certainly, this work was dull and monotonous, but it brought in the money Rodrigo needed. Gradually, he immersed himself in this new endeavor and temporarily set aside thoughts of his innovative device, as he had neither the time nor the energy to pursue it. Every day, Rodrigo woke up early in the morning and went for a run to energize himself. Afterward, he would shower and prepare breakfast, usually fresh fruits, oatmeal, and a cup of coffee with milk. By 8 a.m., Rodrigo was already in the workshop, taking on orders and working until late in the evening with a short break for lunch. After work, he usually went home and watched programs about new technologies. Occasionally, he met with friends, but this happened rarely. Rodrigo didn't want to feel like a failure in their company. He thought they were all judging and laughing at him for leaving a prestigious job for a repair workshop. Rodrigo sometimes regretted his decision himself. However, going back to the past was impossible. Besides, Rodrigo was grateful to himself for at least trying. One morning, as usual, Rodrigo went for his run. Outdoors, he instinctively headed to his favorite park, not far from his home. The park had wide pathways, smelled of flowers, and echoed with birdsong. Rodrigo jogged, listening to invigorating music, and enjoyed the gentle breeze on his face, when suddenly he noticed a young boy sitting on one of the benches. He couldn't have been more than 10 years old. The boy was dressed in worn-out and frayed clothes that he had clearly outgrown. He rubbed his eyes as if he had just woken up or was on the verge of tears. Rodrigo stopped. The boy was clearly in distress. "Are you lost?" he asked. The boy looked up at Rodrigo and responded unfriendly, "What's it to you?" "I just thought I could help," Rodrigo replied, beginning to inquire, "Where are your parents? Where do you live?" The boy shook his head. "I don't have parents. Or a home. I live on the streets, staying in different parks every night to avoid attention." "But that's no way to live. You're still so young," Rodrigo exclaimed. "Just don't take me to a children's home," the boy cried out. I ran away from there. Rodrigo sat down next to the boy and sighed. "Was it that bad there?" he asked. The boy nodded without looking up at him. Rodrigo didn't know how to help. Suddenly, an idea struck him. "Listen," he whispered. "If you want, come with me. I work in a workshop repairing equipment nearby. You could help me." The boy widened his eyes in surprise at Rodrigo. "Are you serious?" he asked, incredulous at what he heard. "Quite serious," Rodrigo replied. Still disbelieving, the boy got up from the bench and walked towards the park exit with Rodrigo. "What's your name?" Rodrigo asked. "Luis," the boy replied. "How did you end up on the street?" Rodrigo asked him. Luis sighed heavily. It was clear he didn't want to recall the past. "I used to have parents and a home. We weren't wealthy, and we didn't own the house. My father worked in construction, and my mother was a school janitor. They had to work hard to pay the rent, buy food, and clothes. There was never enough money for anything else. As far as I remember, I never had real toys. I played with whatever I found on the street. Then my father had an accident at the construction site. He fell from a great height and died. My mother couldn't bear it because she loved him so much. Despite having me, she faded away every day. Stress and hard work took their toll. My mother got sick. I begged on the street to buy her medicine, but it was all in vain. She didn't want to live without my father. She died 6 months after his death. I was left alone in the house that we had to pay rent for. While my mother was ill, we didn't pay the landlords for several months. I didn't know what to do. Then the house owners came and took me to the shelter. 2 weeks later, I ran away from there, and ever since then, I've been living on the street, scavenging for scraps, begging, and sleeping in parks and under bridges. Listening to the boy's story, Rodrigo felt goosebumps on his head. And he thought he had a tough life and considered himself an outsider. Now he was ashamed of his thoughts. It turns out there were people in the world who had it much worse. Rodrigo felt even sadder thinking that one of those people was the child walking beside him now. Mentally, Rodrigo vowed to do everything in his power to help Luis. He resolved to save him from his dire situation no matter what. When they arrived at the workshop, Luis whistled in amazement at the sight of the devices, tools, and various parts needed for repairs stored on numerous shelves. "You've got a whole world here," exclaimed Luis. "A whole universe of technology," Rodrigo agreed, smiling. He was pleased that Luis was interested in his work. Perhaps he could teach him to handle simple tasks. Just then, an early client entered the workshop, an elderly woman whose iron had broken, and Rodrigo focused all his attention on her. Meanwhile, Luis wandered around the workshop, examining the tools and mechanisms. After the elderly woman left and Rodrigo immersed himself in his work, Luis quietly sat down next to him and watched his actions. "Do you enjoy watching me work?" the young man asked. "Very much," admitted the boy. Rodrigo shrugged and rubbed his tired eyes. "You should go for a walk instead. Maybe get us both some lunch," Rodrigo suggested. With these words, Rodrigo stood up and walked over to the safe where he kept money. Opening it, he took out a couple of bills and handed them to Luis. "You can keep the change or buy yourself some candy," Rodrigo said. Luis gave him a grateful look and left the workshop. Rodrigo returned to his work and didn't notice that an hour and a half had passed without Luis returning. Rodrigo finally couldn't resist and left the workshop, intending to walk around the area and look for the boy. However, he didn't have to do that. He immediately spotted the small figure of Luis slowly walking along the alley leading to the workshop. Rodrigo noticed that the boy was carrying something heavy in his hands. "What do you have there?" he called out. "I asked you to bring lunch." "I am bringing it," replied Luis, panting. "But there's more than just lunch." Rodrigo was intrigued. When the boy caught up with him, he opened the workshop door for him and followed him inside. Luis placed his burden on an empty table. Rodrigo stepped closer to get a better look. "Here's our food," the boy said, pointing to the paper bags that were still warm. "What's underneath?" Rodrigo asked. "A broken laptop," Luis replied. Rodrigo couldn't believe his ears. "Where did you get it?" "When I was living on the street, I found it in a dumpster. Someone threw it away without bothering to fix it. I didn't know what to do with it, but it seemed valuable to me. I hid it in a secret place and decided I'd come back for it later when I had the chance. Today, seeing the tools and parts, I decided to take it and try to fix it." Rodrigo leaned over the computer and examined it closely. "I hate to disappoint you, kid," he said, "but this laptop isn't worth the effort. I'm not going to spend time on it." "Then let's eat before the food gets cold," the boy simply said. Rodrigo and Luis sat down at the table and took out the food from the bags. The boy had bought stir-fried vegetables with chicken, cheese, pastries with various fillings, sweet donuts, and lemonade. "Where did you get all of this?" Rodrigo marveled. "There wasn't that much money. During the time I spent on the streets, I learned about all the cafes and restaurants. I know where you can eat cheaply but deliciously," Luis explained. Rodrigo nodded in astonishment and gave Luis a thumbs up. The new friends enjoyed their meal heartily. The food turned out to be exceptionally delicious. Rodrigo hadn't known that such good cooking was available nearby. After lunch, Rodrigo received a call requesting him to come to a client's house to pick up a broken item from an elderly woman. Rodrigo agreed, saying he would be at the client's place within an hour. "Luis, you stay here and look after things. Clear the table and wait for me," the young man instructed. If someone brings something in for repair, take the item and record the client's name in this journal. With these words, Rodrigo showed Luis where to record visitor contacts. The boy nodded seriously, indicating he understood everything. Rodrigo left the workshop calmly. It's really good to have an assistant, he thought to himself. Now I can step out during the workday and not lose clients. Rodrigo arrived at the woman's house, picked up her broken hairdryer and food processor, loaded them into the back of his cheap, used van that he had specifically bought for work, and drove back. Entering the workshop, he couldn't believe his eyes. "What have you done here?" Rodrigo raised his eyebrows in surprise. Luis was sitting in the middle of the workshop on the floor, with a disassembled laptop in front of him. Parts were scattered all around, which the boy had taken out of the case. "I just want to fix it," Luis confessed. "You said you didn't have time for it. And I've got plenty of it. When I first saw this laptop, I immediately thought it would be good to fix it. But back then, I didn't have the tools." Rodrigo didn't scold the boy. He liked that Luis wanted to do something useful. Granted, he had serious doubts whether the boy would succeed. However, he kept those thoughts to himself and didn't interfere with the process. Taking out the hairdryer and food processor from the client, he began to disassemble them to identify the malfunction and fix it. Several hours passed. The hairdryer and food processor were ready. Rodrigo looked them over with satisfaction and made sure they worked perfectly. At that moment, he heard some sounds. There was music playing somewhere. Rodrigo looked up in surprise and saw Luis playing a video game on the laptop, sitting cross-legged on the floor. The young man couldn't believe his eyes. "Luis, did you fix it?" Rodrigo asked. The boy momentarily tore himself away from the game to nod briefly and then resumed pressing buttons. "But that's amazing. And fantastic," Rodrigo exclaimed, sitting down next to Luis. He watched the boy play for a while and then asked to try it himself. Luis slid the laptop over to Rodrigo. Rodrigo completed a game level, then closed it and checked how other programs were working. Everything functioned perfectly. "Now you have your own computer, Luis," Rodrigo said, still unable to believe what he had seen. "Later on, I'll connect it to the internet for you." True to his word, Rodrigo connected Luis's laptop to Wi-Fi, and the boy spent the whole evening in headphones borrowed from Rodrigo, watching interesting videos on YouTube. Rodrigo noticed that Luis was selecting shows about electronics and robotics. He was once again thoroughly amazed and decided the next day to entrust Luis with a simple job, suspecting the boy would handle it in no time. And indeed, the next morning, after Luis had spent the night on the workshop sofa, he quickly repaired an electronic alarm clock brought in by an elderly man. "I understand smartphones have alarms too, but I'm used to this one. Please fix it by tomorrow so I don't be late for work," the man had requested. How surprised Rodrigo was when, within half an hour, the alarm clock was working like new again. The client thanked the craftsman profusely and left home extremely satisfied. "Luis, you have a natural talent." Rodrigo praised the boy, handing him most of the money the elderly man had paid for the alarm clock repair. "Now you're officially my assistant," the young man added solemnly, and Luis felt joy and pride. "Awesome," he said. Now Rodrigo's days became less stressful. Luis fixed things in a breeze, as if cracking nuts. The young man never ceased to marvel at his speed and the quality of his work. "Masterful craftsmanship," he would say, and Luis would smile happily. Luis loved being praised. Rodrigo advised Luis to start a piggy bank where the boy could save his earnings. In the evenings, the boy continued watching educational and instructional videos on YouTube, while Rodrigo unexpectedly found the strength to return to a project of his own device, which he had once abandoned. Rodrigo showed his drawings to Luis, who nodded approvingly. "Great idea," the boy said, and the young man smiled with pleasure. "I never thought I'd enjoy hearing praise from a 10-year-old kid," he chuckled to himself. Now, in the evenings, they worked on the project together. Luis made valuable suggestions and offered ideas for improvements. Rodrigo was happy to see his project continue to develop and improve every day. Finally, after several months, they both concluded that the device was ready for use and implementation in production. On that same day, Rodrigo called his friend Diego, whom he had shown the project to once before, and suggested he take another look. "My colleague and I have significantly improved the device, and now it's ready for reevaluation," Rodrigo said. "I hope you and your father are still interested in my proposal." Diego was happy to come and see the improvements Rodrigo had made. He visited his workshop the very next evening and was delighted with the results of their work. "Now I see that you really put in a lot of effort, buddy," Diego approvingly exclaimed. "I'm sure my father will be on board. I'll tell him tonight that your device is ready for mass production and sale." Rodrigo couldn't believe his luck, and Luis, standing nearby, inexplicably frowned. Seeing this, the young man quickly introduced the boy to his friend. "By the way, Diego, this is my little helper. He helped me make key changes and significantly refine my project." Rodrigo's friend couldn't believe what he heard. "But he's only 10 years old," he exclaimed. "Nevertheless, he's incredibly knowledgeable about technology, mechanisms, and devices. He helps me in my workshop and sometimes handles things much faster than I do," Rodrigo explained proudly. "Wow! What a valuable specimen," Diego smiled. "I dream of programming robots," Luis replied. Rodrigo and Diego nodded approvingly. "You'll make it, Luis," Diego said. "You mustn't stop on the path to your dream." Luis remembered these words for life. The next day, Diego called Rodrigo and informed him that his father agreed to launch their device into production with Luis. Rodrigo was over the moon with happiness upon hearing these words. Finally, his efforts had paid off. However, it was too early to relax. While the device underwent various expert tests, Rodrigo and Luis continued to work in the workshop. The boy gradually began to streamline the order-taking process. He decided to create a special bot through which clients could independently place repair orders via Messenger. For several days, he studied expert videos and other materials on creating bots, then developed his own on his old laptop. Nonetheless, the bot worked, and customers happily began using it. Rodrigo never ceased to be amazed by Luis's imagination and skills as the boy continued to devise improvements for the workshop. The young man was grateful for the day fate brought him and the boy together. He allowed Luis to take any parts and use everything available in the workshop. Moreover, the boy ordered missing components online with his own money. 6 months later, he assembled his first robot, which could bring parts to craftsmen and even diagnose some simple device malfunctions. Rodrigo was pleasantly shocked, but knew Luis was capable of even more. Word spread throughout the city about the young man's workshop. Many customers specifically traveled from remote areas to see the curious robots and other contraptions Luis developed. No one believed a 10-year-old boy had created all this. Rodrigo's business began to grow, and he realized he could no longer manage alone. He decided to rent another space nearby and hired 2 more craftsmen. Gradually, his workshop transformed from a small garage into a full-fledged enterprise with modern equipment. Every day, Luis significantly improved his programming and robotics skills. He began participating in local technology competitions and exhibitions, where he showcased projects and received not only recognition for his work but also substantial cash prizes. With this money, Luis ordered materials for a new robot he wanted to implement in the workshop. According to the boy's plan, the robot was to have a compact and ergonomic design. He ordered a lightweight aluminum alloy body from the manufacturer's website. "This will ensure the robot's high reliability and durability," he explained to Rodrigo. "Additionally, I decided to equip it with manipulators with flexible joints so that it can perform various tasks with high precision." Rodrigo watched with bated breath as Luis gave birth to his new masterpiece. The boy poured his heart into the robot, as if creating a friend. "I want to name him Alf, after the friendly alien from the famous series," Luis shared with Rodrigo, who smiled in response. "A wonderful name," the young man remarked. The birth process of Alf was not fast, but many people already knew about it. Among them were the workshop's clients, their acquaintances, and Rodrigo's friends. Rumors spread at lightning speed that Luis was working on a new unique robot. One evening, there was a knock on the workshop door. Rodrigo got up from his desk and opened it. Standing there was a young and very attractive woman with dark wavy hair. She was dressed in a formal light suit and held a notepad and a voice recorder. "Hello, my name is Laura. I'm a reporter from the main city publication. May I come in and ask you and the boy named Luis a few questions?" Honestly, Rodrigo didn't like journalists and members of the press. He wasn't seeking fame or recognition, preferring to remain in the shadows, providing himself and Luis with peace and privacy. However, something about this woman struck him, and he couldn't refuse her. "Of course, we'll answer your questions if the interview doesn't take too long," Rodrigo said. Laura smiled brightly. "Of course. I'll try to be as brief as possible." They entered the workshop, and Rodrigo showed Laura to the chair where clients usually sat while waiting for their orders. Laura sat down and briskly opened her notepad. Luis joined them, and Laura, like others who saw him for the first time, looked at him with interest and surprise. "Luis, my name is Laura, and I'm very pleased to meet you in person," the woman said. Likewise, Luis nodded in response. "Tell me about your new project," Laura requested, taking out a pen and preparing her voice recorder. "Alf will be an innovative robot project utilizing the latest technologies, including artificial intelligence. The robot will be equipped with numerous sensors and high-resolution cameras. Alf will be able to analyze data in real time, make decisions, and adapt to various work environments," Luis explained. Laura diligently wrote down the boy's words in her notepad. Rodrigo, almost unaware, kept a close eye on her. He noticed that one strand of her hair had escaped the rest and fell on her face. He struggled to resist the urge to tuck it behind her ear. He felt his heart beating faster than usual when he looked at Laura. "She's really charming," he thought to himself. "What tasks will Alf perform?" Laura asked in the meantime. Luis promptly began listing. He will be able to detect malfunctions and autonomously repair them with high precision and speed, significantly speeding up the repair process and allowing us to serve more clients. Additionally, using sensors and cameras, Alf will inspect the quality of craftsmen's work, identifying defects if they occur. Then the robot will prepare the items for shipping to clients who live far away. Laura nodded at each of Luis's words. When he finished, she looked up at the boy with admiration. "This is incredible. I can't wait to see this robot in action," she exclaimed. Suddenly, Rodrigo felt a twinge of jealousy. How he wished the woman would look at him like that right now. He knew it was silly, but he couldn't help himself. Laura had intrigued him somehow. "Thank you for the opportunity to conduct this exclusive interview," the woman said as Rodrigo escorted her to the door. He took a deep breath and asked, "Can I have your phone number?" Laura raised an eyebrow in surprise. "But I'm at work," she replied, flustered. Rodrigo felt awkward. Sensing this, the woman quickly nodded. "Okay, write it down," she said. After dictating her number, Laura asked Rodrigo to message her on any messenger so she could send him the completed interview with Luis later. The young man nodded, thinking to himself that Laura had given him her number out of politeness. Nevertheless, he sent her a smiley so she would have his contact. Returning to Luis, who was already deeply engrossed in his robot again, Rodrigo sighed and tried to push the woman he liked out of his mind. "She's too focused on her work," he decided. Some time passed, and Luis's robot was nearly ready when a terrible thing happened. It occurred one morning when Rodrigo arrived at the workshop as usual before the start of a new workday. He noticed that the workshop window was missing. Luis met him at the door, looking distressed. "Luis, what happened?" "What happened to the window?" the young man exclaimed anxiously. "The robot, my Alf, he's gone," the boy barely managed to say. It was clear he was in deep shock. "What?" Rodrigo couldn't believe his ears. He ushered the boy into the workshop and sat him down. Pouring a glass of water, he handed it to Luis, who took a sip. "Tell me how this happened," Rodrigo requested. Luis took a shaky breath and began to speak. "I was sleeping soundly as usual. I didn't have any dreams. I heard noise in my sleep, but I didn't pay attention to it. When I got up early in the morning, I saw that the robot wasn't in its usual place. I think someone stole him." Tears streamed down the boy's cheeks as he spoke. Rodrigo ran his hands through his hair. "But that can't be," he couldn't believe it. "We need to call the police," Luis said through tears. "You're right," Rodrigo collected his thoughts. He stood up and quickly dialed the number of the nearest police station from his pocket. The phone was answered promptly, and Rodrigo explained the situation in a hurried manner. The policeman was silent for a moment, seemingly thinking he was being pranked. "What did you say?" "Someone stole a super technological robot from you," he asked again. "Yes, exactly. We've had a robot stolen," Rodrigo repeated. Police arrived a couple of hours later and took statements from Luis. He recounted the story that Rodrigo had heard from him that morning. He himself wondered who exactly would need to steal a robot. Of course, many people knew about the robot, but still, Rodrigo pondered. Ordinary people wouldn't need it. Only if they want to sell it to someone. Right at that moment, the young man's smartphone vibrated in his pocket. A message came from Laura. "The interview came out this morning. I'll send you a copy with the courier," the girl wrote. At the end of the message was a cheerful smiley. For some reason, it greatly angered Rodrigo. Not understanding what he was doing, he quickly typed a reply, "You don't need to bother. We no longer have the robot." Without a second thought, he pressed the send button. Laura's reply came almost instantly. "What happened?" she wrote. "Alf was stolen," Rodrigo replied succinctly. "I'm coming over right away," Laura's message came promptly. "Let's not make a big deal out of this," the young man wrote. The girl's reply only angered him more. These journalists were ready to turn any misfortune into material for their tabloids. But what Laura wrote surprised and touched Rodrigo deeply. "I just want to support you," she typed. The young man couldn't believe his eyes. Could it be? Could she really be this compassionate? Laura arrived 20 minutes later. She entered the workshop, and somehow, it immediately felt calmer. "Rodrigo, Luis, I'm so sorry," the girl awkwardly said. Rodrigo nodded, Luis sniffled. They sat each in their own corner, bewildered and a bit lonely. "Just don't ask how it happened anymore," Luis grumbled. "I'm tired of talking about it." "Okay," Laura agreed. "Can I just sit with you guys, then?" Luis nodded gloomily, not understanding how this would help. Yet, Laura's presence seemed to positively affect him for some reason. Rodrigo made coffee for himself and the girl, and hot cocoa for Luis. He just needed something to keep himself occupied. An hour later, the police called, saying they had found some evidence after reviewing the street camera footage. "Wait for me at the workshop, I'll be there soon," the officer informed. After hanging up, Rodrigo recounted the conversation with the policeman to Luis and Laura. Luis looked at Rodrigo hopefully. "I hope they find Alf soon. He means a lot to me now." "Of course," Laura nodded understandingly. "It's the result of your long and hard work. I believe the police will locate the thief and return your robot very soon." Rodrigo just nodded thoughtfully. He felt a strong tension. He also desperately wanted the robot to be found. Finally, the police officer arrived. Rodrigo seated him in a visitor's chair, and he began to speak. "We reviewed the camera footage and saw that early in the morning, a van arrived near the workshop. A person wearing a mask got out of it. It seems to be a fairly young man. He used some tool to cut the glass and then entered through the window. We can't say for sure who was driving the van, but it seems to have been a young woman with long wavy hair." Silence fell in the room. Rodrigo mechanically glanced at Laura's hair, and she shrunk and shifted under his gaze. The young man stirred. Could it be you? He asked. How did I not realize? You knew about the robot. Someone must have bribed you. Laura blushed and quickly shook her head. Rodrigo, how could you think that? Do you really suspect me? The young man stared at Laura for a minute in silence. I don't even know what to think anymore, he replied with a helpless gesture. I just don't want Luis's dream to shatter. If it was you, please return the robot, and we can settle this peacefully. Laura couldn't hold back tears. But it really wasn't me. I would never do something like this. Luis's dream is dear to me too. Do you really think I would come here after all this and sit with you, secretly mocking everything? Throughout this time, Luis watched the girl attentively, not saying a word. It's definitely not her, he finally said, and with some sixth sense, Rodrigo knew the boy was right. He felt ashamed for suspecting Laura. I'm sorry, he said. I'm just very upset and angry. This situation has shaken me to the core. Laura wiped her tears and quietly sniffled. I completely understand you. If I were in your place, I would probably think the same. But then who stole the robot? Rodrigo asked, turning to the police officer. The officer shrugged. We're working on it. According to our data, the van used by the thieves was quite expensive. It couldn't have been just some random person, like your client, for example. It seems like a big shot was involved. Rodrigo flinched. Suddenly, he thought of Diego, who knew about Luis's robot because the young man had recently visited the production site and inadvertently boasted to his friend. Diego had looked at him strangely and said nothing. Rodrigo had been offended, thinking his friend didn't appreciate the importance of Luis's work. Now, Diego's reaction seemed to take on a new light. Moreover, he remembered that Diego's girlfriend, who worked with him, also had long wavy hair. Had Rodrigo betrayed his best friend? He decided to find out immediately. Dialing Diego's number, he directly asked him if he knew anything about Luis's robot being stolen. Diego remained silent for a while, then began to deny everything. Rodrigo bid him farewell and hung up. Can you check Diego Martinez's house and his father's company? Can you get a search warrant? I suspect the robot might be there, Rodrigo asked the police. The officer quickly nodded and went to the station. There was no news from him for 2 whole days. Rodrigo and Luis were beside themselves with worry and impatience. A few times, representatives of the press visited the workshop, but the young man and the boy sent them away, refusing to comment on what had happened. Finally, Rodrigo was summoned to the police station. Luis went with him. When they entered the investigator's office, the young man was surprised to see Diego there. So it was you? Rodrigo blurted out without greeting. Forgive me, friend, Diego quietly replied, without raising his head. You're not my friend anymore. Rodrigo exclaimed angrily. Diego just sighed in response. Meanwhile, Luis saw the robot through the glass window and was overjoyed. Can I take him now? He asked the policeman, his heart pounding. The officer shook his head. Not until the investigation is over, son, he replied. Luis's spirits sank. He had hoped to return to work within a few hours. Rodrigo sat down, looking at Diego with disdain. Diego finally met his gaze. I'm sorry, Rodrigo. You have no idea how envious I was of you. Your invention, which will soon be on the market, is beyond praise. And this robot. I've been thinking for so long, why you and not me? Why did this boy's luck fall to you? If I had found him, I would have become a multimillionaire. And so you decided to steal his invention? I was planning to sell it abroad, knowing I wouldn't get much money for it. I just couldn't bear to see your success. Rodrigo looked at his former friend with even greater contempt. You'll have to, he muttered, getting up and heading for the door. Luis followed him. My father knows nothing about this. Diego shouted. Don't cut ties with him. Rodrigo turned for a moment, nodded, and left the room. The robot was returned a week later. Diego was released because his father paid a large sum for his release. However, he was immediately fired from his position. Firstly, his father was outraged by Diego's actions and wanted to teach him a lesson. Secondly, he didn't want his son's wrongdoing to tarnish the reputation of his company. Laura stayed in touch constantly, asking about progress, and finally Rodrigo delighted her with good news. The girl was very happy that Luis was now okay and his robot had been returned. Now that everything was over, it seemed there was nothing more for the young people to talk about. However, Rodrigo didn't want to lose their connection. So, after some hesitation, he decided to invite Laura to a restaurant. "I would like to celebrate this event with you. You've supported us from the very beginning," he explained. Laura gladly accepted. "I would be delighted to accept your invitation. I'm glad we can finally relax from these awful experiences." The evening went wonderfully. The young people had a great time, chatting, enjoying delicious food, and getting to know each other better. When Rodrigo escorted Laura home, stars were shining in the sky. The evening was filled with the scent of flowers, and white moths fluttered in the air. "What a magical night," whispered Laura. At that moment, she looked beautiful in her white dress with a flowing skirt. Rodrigo was so enchanted that he couldn't utter a word. He didn't want to speak and spoil the magic of the moment. As they reached Laura's doorstep, she stopped and kissed Rodrigo on the cheek. In response, Rodrigo hugged her. Thus began their romance, which eventually led to marriage. Things were also going more than well for Luis. He completed work on the robot and decided to participate in an international technology and innovation competition. Alpha took first place, and Luis received a substantial cash prize, as well as acquiring new connections and useful acquaintances. He was invited to study at several prestigious universities in the capital in advance, and also offered appearances on television. Luis was very nervous, but his interview couldn't have gone better. The boy became famous throughout the country. "When I used to sleep on a bench in the park, I couldn't dream of such a life," Luis confessed as he and Rodrigo drove home. "Yes, but don't think it was just luck," replied Rodrigo. "You have natural talent, and your skill will bring great benefits to people." Several months later, Rodrigo and Laura adopted Luis and moved to a new spacious home. Luis continued to work in robotics until it was time to enter university. He was admitted without exams directly to the third year. Professors were impressed by the boy's abilities, and 2 years later he graduated from university with honors. Luis was hired for a leading position in a large international company, and he moved there to explore new and exciting growth opportunities.